As the machines around him beeped their rhythmic song of finality, the frail old man, once a proud soldier, whispered a confession that shocked the room. "I betrayed them. For money," he croaked, his voice trembling as much as his failing body. 50 years of guilt bubbled to the surface, and in that moment, he revealed a truth that had haunted him since Vietnam. His words were a trigger, unraveling a web of betrayal, greed, and vengeance that refused to stay buried with the war. The year was 1969, and the jungles of Vietnam pulsed with tension, the kind only war could bring. James "Red" Malloy crouched low beneath the dense canopy, his rifle steady in calloused hands. His face, streaked with sweat and dirt, betrayed nothing of the storm inside him. To his squad he was loyal, dependable, a soldier through and through. Yet deep within, Red harbored a secret that would soon shatter the bond he shared with the men he called brothers. Raven's squad was no ordinary unit. They were special ops, the best of the best, known for taking on missions others wouldn't dare. Their latest assignment was critical: intercept a Viet Cong gold shipment along a covert jungle route. Intelligence suggested the gold was funding enemy operations. Success would cripple the Viet Cong's efforts, a victory for their side. But for Red, this mission meant something else: escape, a chance to leave war behind for a life he'd only dreamed of. Days earlier, during a supply run in a nearby village, Red had been approached by a man whose face was obscured by the brim of a straw hat. The stranger's English was flawless, his voice low and calm. "Sergeant Malloy," he said, "I know you. I know what you want." Red instinctively reached for his sidearm, but the man raised his hands in peace. "The gold your unit is hunting. It's worth far more than your commanders will ever tell you," the man said. "Millions. Enough to change your life forever. I can help you get it, but you'll have to make a choice. Them or yourself." At first, Red dismissed the man's words. Yet, as the days passed, the offer lingered, gnawing at the edges of his mind. The thought of leaving the war, of escaping the blood and chaos, was intoxicating. And so, Red made a choice that would alter the fate of his squad. The trek through the jungle was grueling. The air was thick with humidity, clinging to their skin. The trail was narrow, flanked by dense vegetation that seemed to close in on them. Captain Mason, their unflinching leader, moved at the front, his sharp eyes scanning for danger. Mason was a man of unshakable resolve, a leader who inspired loyalty and trust. But even Mason couldn't quell the unease growing in Red's gut. Mason turned back to the squad, his face grim but calm. "Stay sharp, eyes on the trail and on each other." His voice carried an authority that had pulled them through countless missions before. Red nodded along with the others, but his mind was elsewhere, focused on the promise of riches that awaited him if he played his cards right. "Hold up," Mason said, raising a fist. The squad halted, weapons ready. Mason crouched, his gaze fixed on the trail ahead. "Something's not right," he muttered. Red's heart pounded, not from fear of the enemy, but from the weight of his decision. "There's a shortcut," he said, pointing to an overgrown path. "Could save us time." Mason turned to him, his expression unreadable. "You sure about that, Malloy?" Red nodded, his voice steady. "Positive." Reluctantly, Mason gave the order, and the squad moved on to the new trail. The jungle grew quieter, the usual sounds replaced by an unsettling silence. Red felt the tension rising with every step. Then it happened. The first explosion tore through the jungle, sending dirt and debris skyward. Gunfire followed, sharp and relentless. Viet Cong soldiers emerged from hidden positions, their ambush perfectly timed. Chaos erupted as Raven squad scrambled for cover. Mason's voice rang out, "Take cover! Return fire!" Red ducked behind a tree, his rifle in hand. He fired a few rounds, careful not to expose himself too much. He stayed close to Private Jenkins, the youngest in the squad. "I've got your back," Red lied as Jenkins struggled to reload. but a sharp crack rang out and Jenkins fell, a bullet tearing through his chest. His wide eyes locked onto Red's, filled with confusion and betrayal. "Why?" Jenkins choked before the light left his eyes. Red froze, his breath caught. For a moment he thought of confessing, of stopping the madness, but it was too late. As the firefight raged on, Red found Mason dragging a wounded Lieutenant Brooks to safety. "We've been set up," Mason shouted, fury in his voice. "I don't know how they found us," Red said, his voice shaking just enough to sound convincing. By the time the firefight ended, Raven's squad was decimated. Only a handful of survivors emerged from the carnage, retreating into the jungle under the cover of darkness. The mission was a failure. The gold lost, the squad broken. As they regrouped, Mason approached Red, his piercing eyes locking onto him. "That shortcut you suggested," Mason said, his voice low and dangerous, "it led us straight into hell." Red met Mason's gaze, forcing himself to appear calm. "It was a mistake," he said. But the doubt in Mason's eyes was unmistakable. As the survivors tended to their wounds and mourned their dead, Red couldn't shake the feeling that Mason would never stop searching for the truth. And neither would the ghosts of the men he had betrayed. The remnants of Raven's squad moved silently through the jungle, their bodies battered, their spirits shattered. The weight of failure hung in the air, mingling with the stench of gunpowder and sweat. Captain Mason led the way, his jaw set in grim determination. Behind him, Red Malloy trailed in silence, his thoughts churning with the echoes of the ambush. Every snap of a twig seemed to carry the accusations of his fallen comrades. The jungle felt alive, not just with the sounds of nature but with the ghosts of Raven's squad. Mason's words from the ambush replayed in Red's mind. That shortcut, it led us straight into hell. The captain's eyes, sharp and unyielding, lingered on Red now, as if searching for a crack in his mask. Red knew the lie wouldn't hold forever. "Hold position," Mason commanded in a hushed voice, raising a fist. The squad halted, crouching low. Mason scanned the area ahead, his instincts honed from years of combat. Red watched him, a mixture of admiration and dread twisting in his gut. Mason was the backbone of Raven's squad. Red had fractured that foundation, and the strain was evident in Mason's gaze. Lieutenant Brooks, still limping, leaned against a tree and wiped his brow. "We need to find a safe place to regroup," he muttered. "We're sitting ducks out here." Mason nodded, but didn't move. "We'll push forward a little further. There's a clearing ahead. We can set up camp there." His gaze flickered to Red for a moment. "Stay sharp." The clearing was small but defensible, surrounded by dense vegetation. As the squad settled in, Red felt the weight of their grief. Jenkins, Brooks, and the others, they had trusted him, they had believed in him, and he had led them to slaughter. Yet even as guilt gnawed at him, the promise of wealth flickered in the back of his mind, a glimmer in the darkness he had created. Mason pulled Red aside as the others tended to their wounds. "What happened back there, Malloy?" Mason's voice was low, almost conversational, but his eyes were piercing. "That ambush wasn't luck. They knew we were coming." Red felt his pulse quicken. He met Mason's gaze, forcing his voice to stay steady. "I don't know, Captain. Maybe our intel was bad. Maybe we weren't as quiet as we thought." Mason didn't reply immediately. He studied Red with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Then, with a curt nod, he stepped away. But Red knew this wasn't over. Mason wasn't the type to let go of something that didn't sit right. As night fell, the jungle came alive with the sounds of insects and distant animal cries. The squad sat in a loose circle around a small fire, their faces illuminated by its flickering light. Conversation was sparse, their spirits too low for banter. Brooks broke the silence first. "Jenkins didn't deserve that," he said, his voice heavy. "Kid barely knew how to shave, and now he's—" He stopped, shaking his head. "We all know the risks," Mason said quietly. doesn't make it easier. Red stared into the fire, the flickering flames reflected in his hollow eyes. He wanted to say something, to offer comfort, but the words caught in his throat. Anything he said would be a lie, and he had lied enough for one lifetime. The fire burned low as the hours dragged on, and one by one the squad members drifted into restless sleep. Red remained awake, haunted by the faces of those he had betrayed. But it wasn't just guilt that kept him up. It was fear. Mason's suspicion was a ticking time bomb. As dawn broke, Mason roused the squad. "We're moving out," he announced. "We can't stay here any longer." The journey resumed, each step a grueling test of endurance. Red stayed near the back of the formation, his thoughts racing. He had gotten them into this mess, but he wasn't sure how to get them out. The gold was still out there, somewhere in enemy hands, and the shadowy figure who had set this in motion was waiting for him to fulfill his end of the bargain. By midday, the squad stumbled upon an abandoned Viet Cong campsite. The area was littered with the remnants of a hasty retreat, discarded supplies, extinguished fires, and bloodstains in the dirt. Mason signaled for the squad to spread out and search the area. Red's stomach churned as he sifted through the debris. Every step felt like walking through a graveyard. "Over here," Brooks called out, holding up a map he had found beneath a pile of torn papers. Mason took it from him, his eyes narrowing as he studied it. "Looks like they're heading for the river," he muttered. "If we move fast, we might cut them off." Red's heart sank. The river was miles away, and the trek would push the squad to their limits. But Mason's determination was unshakable, and Red knew there was no arguing with him. As the squad prepared to move, Mason pulled Red aside again. "I don't know what's going on with you, Malloy," he said, his voice low and filled with quiet menace, "but I'm watching you. Don't think for a second that I'm not." Red nodded, forcing a neutral expression. But inside, panic was setting in. The walls were closing in, and he didn't know how much longer he could hold them off. The river stretched before them like a glistening serpent, winding through the dense jungle. The sun bore down on Raven's squad as they crouched in the undergrowth, their breaths shallow, their bodies worn. Captain Mason studied the enemy encampment on the riverbank through binoculars, his jaw tight. They had tracked the Viet Cong here after days of relentless pursuit. For Mason, this was unfinished business. For Red Malloy, it felt like an inescapable dead end. From their hidden position, Red could see the gold bars glinting in the sunlight, stacked neatly beside crates of weapons and supplies. The treasure gleamed like a cruel promise. A future free from the war, free from guilt. Yet it was also the cause of everything that had gone wrong. The shortcut, the ambush, Jenkins' blood, all of it led back to the gold. It wasn't just a prize, it was a curse. Still, its allure was undeniable. Red's fingers itched as he gripped his rifle, his thoughts twisting between hope and— "Here's the plan," Mason whispered, crouching beside the squad. His voice was steady, but his eyes burned with intensity. He sketched a crude map in the dirt. "Brooks, take the flank with Jenkins. Draw their attention to the perimeter. Malloy, you're with me. We're going straight for the gold. Quiet and clean. No unnecessary risks." Red nodded along with the others, though Mason's words cut through him. Quiet and clean. If only things were ever that simple. Mason's suspicion of him hadn't eased since the ambush. Red felt the captain's eyes on him constantly, and every step deeper into the jungle felt like walking into his own trap. As the squad moved into position, Red trailed Mason, his grip tightening on his weapon. Every rustle of leaves, every muffled voice from the Viet Cong soldiers ahead made his chest tighten. He felt like prey in a predator's territory. Mason raised his fist, signaling a halt. He turned, his voice barely audible. "You good?" "Always," Red lied, forcing his voice to stay even. Mason gave a curt nod, and they crept forward. The camp was now in full view, its occupants oblivious to the danger lurking nearby. Brooks and the others took their positions, waiting for Mason's signal. The plan was simple. create a diversion while Mason and Red secured the shipment. But as Red crouched behind a tree, watching the gold shimmer in the sunlight, other plans crept into his mind. The gold was so close. Its polished bars seemed to glow, their allure almost magnetic. Mason was just ahead, his focus on the task. For a fleeting moment, Red considered it, taking Mason out and running with the gold. But then what? The blood already on his hands was suffocating. Could he carry more? A snap of a branch startled him, and Mason turned sharply, his eyes narrowing. "Stay sharp," Mason hissed. Red nodded, forcing himself back into the moment. The diversion began with the crack of gunfire. Brooks and his group opened fire from the tree line, drawing the Viet Cong soldiers into disarray. Mason motioned for Red to follow, and they moved swiftly to the crates. Mason pried one open, revealing the neatly stacked gold bars inside. "Hurry," Mason ordered, his voice sharp. "We're on borrowed time." Red hefted one of the bars, its weight heavier than he'd imagined. It wasn't just physical. It felt like it carried every life it had cost. Mason worked quickly, stuffing the bars into a rucksack. But the crackle of gunfire grew louder, closer. The diversion wasn't holding. Then it happened. A shout in Vietnamese, far too close. Red spun, raising his rifle, and fired. The Viet Cong soldier dropped, but the shot was deafening, a thunderclap that alerted the entire camp. Mason cursed, grabbing the rucksack. "We're blown! Move!" They sprinted from the crates, the jungle exploding with gunfire behind them. Red's legs burned as he pushed forward, his breath ragged. Mason's anger cut through the chaos. "This never should have happened," he growled. "You're not yourself, Malloy. I don't know what's going on, but we're going to have a talk." His words were cut short as a bullet zipped past, embedding in a tree trunk. Mason swore, refocusing on their escape, but the accusation hung in the air like a blade. They finally reached the fallback point where Brooks and the others waited, their faces pale and etched with fear. "What the hell happened?" Brooks demanded. "They knew," Mason said, his tone clipped. "We've been compromised. Again." His eyes fell on Red, sharp and accusatory. Red swallowed hard, his silence louder than any excuse. The gold had slipped through his fingers, and with it, the illusion that he could escape unscathed. Mason stepped closer, his voice low and cutting. "This is on you, Malloy. I don't know how, but it is, and I'm going to find out." Red's throat tightened as Mason's gaze bored into him. The Blood Money's curse wasn't just his burden anymore. It was seeping into them all, like poison in their veins. The oppressive heat of the jungle clung to Raven's squad as they trudged through dense foliage, each step heavier than the last. The air was thick with tension, and Captain Mason's silence was as suffocating as the humidity. He led the squad without a word, his sharp eyes scanning the jungle for threats, or something else entirely. Behind him, Red Malloy lingered at the rear, his thoughts racing, his nerves frayed. Mason's words from the previous night echoed in Red's mind. "This is on you, Malloy. I don't know how, but it is." Red had stayed silent under Mason's scrutiny, but he knew the captain wasn't done. Mason was relentless once he caught the scent of something amiss, and Red's lies were starting to reek. "We'll stop here," Mason announced, raising his hand. The squad reached a shallow ravine, its rocky walls offering some cover. Mechanically, they dropped their gear, exhaustion etched into every movement. Brooks leaned against a tree, pale and sweating. "We're not going to make it to the river like this," he muttered. Mason ignored him, pacing along the ravine's edge. Red could feel the weight of Mason's suspicion pressing down on him, heavier than the jungle heat. Mason wasn't just looking for threats in the trees. He was looking for cracks in Red's facade. As night fell, the squad gathered around a small fire, their usual camaraderie replaced by strained silence. Mason finally broke it, his voice calm but sharp. "I've been thinking about the ambush." Red's stomach churned. "They knew we were coming," Mason continued, his eyes flicking between the men. We've been careful, no comms, no loose ends. So how did they know? Either our intel was bad. His gaze landed on Red, the firelight reflecting in his piercing eyes. Or someone gave us up. The accusation was subtle but devastating. Brooks shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Red. You don't think... He started, but Mason silenced him with a look. I don't know what to think yet, Mason said, but someone's been lying to us. Red felt the weight of their stares, his throat tightening. He wanted to deny it, to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. The silence stretched, damning in its own way. Mason stood abruptly, his movements deliberate. Get some rest, he said flatly. We move at first light. The squad dispersed, but Red remained by the fire, his mind racing. Mason didn't have proof, not yet, but his suspicions were growing. And once Mason was sure, Red knew there'd be no escape. Sleep was impossible. Red lay on his back, his hand resting on the pistol at his side. Every rustle of leaves sounded like Mason creeping closer, ready to exact vengeance. The paranoia was suffocating. Even the thought of gold, once a promise of freedom, felt like a chain. The cost had been too high. At dawn, they moved out in tense silence, the jungle's terrain growing more unforgiving with each step. Mason set a brutal pace, his focus unyielding. Red struggled to keep up, his mind clouded with fear. By midday, they stumbled upon the remnants of a Viet Cong camp. The scene was eerily familiar. Discarded supplies, extinguished fires, and the faint metallic scent of blood. Search the area, Mason ordered. Red sifted through a pile of torn maps, his hands trembling. Find anything? Mason's voice cut through the stillness. Nothing useful, Red lied, forcing his voice to remain steady. Mason didn't respond, but his gaze lingered, heavy with suspicion. They pressed on, the tension between them thickening with each mile. The jungle, which had once offered cover, now felt like a trap, its dense canopy suffocating. When they reached the river's outskirts, the squad collapsed onto the ground, their bodies unable to carry them further without rest. Brooks sat with his back against a tree, his face gaunt. How much longer do we keep this up? He muttered, though no one answered. Mason, as always, remained standing, his gaze sweeping over the group before settling on Red. Without a word, he motioned for Red to follow him. Walk with me, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Red obeyed, his pulse pounding in his ears. Mason led him to the riverbank, the sound of rushing water masking their voices. The sight of the river, a shimmering expanse that should have symbolized hope, felt like a cruel reminder of how far Red had fallen. I'm going to ask you this once, Mason said, his voice low and menacing. Did you betray us? Red froze, his breath catching. He met Mason's gaze, saw the fire in his eyes, and realized there was no way out. The truth would come out eventually, but here and now, it was a matter of survival. No, Red said, his voice barely audible. Mason studied him for what felt like an eternity before nodding. But the captain's expression didn't soften. For your sake, I hope that's true. As they returned to the squad, Red felt the weight of Mason's distrust settle over him like a shroud. The captain didn't trust him, and it was only a matter of time before the rest of the squad followed suit. Red knew he was running out of time. The ghost of his betrayal wasn't just haunting him, it was closing in, and when it caught him, there would be no mercy. The river glimmered faintly under the jungle canopy, its glassy surface reflecting fragments of sunlight. For Raven's squad, it was no refuge, only a path leading them closer to unseen dangers. Captain Mason moved ahead silently, his gaze scanning the shadows. Red Malloy followed, his nerves fraying with every step. Mason hadn't spoken much since their tense conversation, but the weight of his suspicion lingered like a storm cloud, palpable to everyone in the squad. They trudged along the muddy bank, their boots sinking into the muck with each step. The jungle around them seemed quieter than usual, the only sounds their labored breaths and the soft rush of water. Red tried to stay invisible within the formation, but Mason's presence loomed, unrelenting. Every time Mason turned his head, it felt as if his eyes lingered on Red a moment too long. "Hold up," Mason said suddenly, raising a fist. The squad froze, crouching low. Mason pointed at fresh tracks in the mud near the riverbank. "They're close," he muttered. "Fan out. Stay sharp." The squad obeyed, rifles raised, eyes scanning for movement. Red's heart pounded as he advanced alongside Brooks. Every step felt like walking into a trap, and Mason's distrust pressed harder with each passing moment. Brooks whispered sharply, "Keep close. No mistakes." They found the enemy camp just before sunset. It was tucked beneath an overhang, its fire pit extinguished, its occupants gone. The scent of burnt wood lingered, and the sight of scattered supplies hinted at a hurried departure. "Clear," Brooks whispered, his rifle sweeping the area. Mason stepped forward, his jaw tightening as he surveyed the scene. "They're ahead. Pack light. We move now." The squad moved to comply, but Red hesitated. His eyes caught a faint glint near the fire pit. Crouching, he unearthed a partially buried canvas sack. Inside were 2 gold bars, their polished surfaces gleaming even in the fading light. His stomach twisted as he zipped the sack shut and stood. "What is it, Malloy?" Mason's voice cut sharply through the quiet. "Just supplies," Red lied, keeping his tone even. Mason stared for a moment before turning away, but the flicker of doubt in his expression told Red he hadn't been entirely believed. As they left the camp, the image of the gold haunted Red. It wasn't the full shipment, but it was enough to rekindle the greed he'd tried to bury. The thought churned in his gut. The gold was close, but every step closer seemed to demand more blood. He had already given so much. Night fell quickly, and the jungle descended into darkness. The squad's flashlights flickered as they navigated uneven ground, their progress slow and cautious. Red could barely see, but Mason's presence was palpable, always nearby. When they stopped near a cluster of trees, Brooks leaned heavily against a trunk. "We need rest," he said, his voice barely audible. "Too exposed," Mason replied curtly. "1 more hour." Red's body ached for rest, but his mind refused to settle. The memory of the gold weighed on him, as did the ever-present specter of Mason's suspicion. Every rustle of leaves felt like a harbinger of disaster. A sudden noise in the underbrush snapped Red's focus. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his rifle snapping to attention. The rustling grew louder, and the squad tensed. Mason's voice cut through the tension. "Eyes up! Stay together!" The jungle erupted. Gunfire lit the night as Viet Cong soldiers emerged from the shadows. Chaos broke loose as bullets tore through the air. The squad scattered, diving for cover. Red pressed himself against a fallen log, his rifle shaking in his hands. He fired blindly, the noise deafening. "Malloy, on me!" Mason's shout rang out. Red hesitated, his heart pounding. He saw Mason, crouched a few yards away, his rifle aimed at the advancing enemy. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Red saw a Viet Cong soldier emerge, his weapon trained on Mason. Red raised his rifle, his finger on the trigger, but the shot came from somewhere else. Mason crumpled to the ground. Time seemed to freeze as Red stared at the fallen captain. The man who had been their leader, their anchor, was now lifeless in the mud. Red's betrayal, his lies, the gold, it all rushed to the forefront of his mind, suffocating him. The firefight raged on, but Red could barely register it. He crawled toward Mason's body, his breath ragged. For a moment he thought of grabbing Mason's dog tags, something to prove he had been there, to carry a fragment of his guilt. But the weight of what he'd done rooted him in place. When the squad finally regrouped, battered and broken, they retreated into the jungle under the cover of darkness. Mason was gone, and with him, the fragile thread that had held Raven's squad together. As they pressed deeper into the jungle, Red felt the ghost of Mason following him, colder and heavier than ever. The river had claimed its price, and the gold had only brought death. But for Red, there was still one haunting thought. The betrayal wasn't over yet. The jungle's shadows seemed darker without Mason leading them. Every step forward felt heavier, more dangerous, as though the jungle itself had turned hostile. Red Malloy trailed at the back of what remained of Raven's squad, his chest tightening with every glance from his comrades. Mason had been their anchor, their moral compass. Without him, they were a group of armed men walking a path to nowhere. Brooks, now the de facto leader, barked orders in a strained voice. Stay together, eyes on the tree line. He looked at Red as he said it, the emphasis unmistakable. Red kept his head down, gripping his rifle tightly. The weight of Mason's death bore down on him, but his betrayal, still secret, gnawed at him even more. The squad reached a clearing near the river, its surface reflecting the muted light of the overcast sky. They were low on supplies, low on morale, and lower still on trust. Brooks gestured for them to stop. "We'll set up here for the night. Keep it quiet. I don't want another ambush." Red sat at the edge of the clearing, his back against a tree, his thoughts racing. The Viet Cong had been tipped off about their movements. Mason had all but accused him of being the informant before his death. And now, with Mason gone, there was no one to protect Red from the other's suspicion. Brooks approached him, crouching beside the tree. His voice was low, but his tone carried an edge. "Malloy, I want to know what happened back there." Red met his gaze, his chest tightening. "What are you talking about?" "You hesitated," Brooks said. "When Mason called for you, you didn't move, and then he—" His voice trailed off, but the accusation was clear. "I didn't know what to do," Red said quickly. "It was chaos. We were all scrambling." Brooks stared at him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Just remember, Malloy, we're all watching." As Brooks walked away, Red exhaled shakily. He couldn't shake the feeling that his time was running out. The squad would turn on him eventually. It was only a question of when. Night fell, and the jungle came alive with its usual chorus of insects and distant animal cries. Red couldn't sleep. His mind replayed the moment Mason fell, the sound of the gunshot echoing in his ears. The weight of the gold bars in the canvas sack he had hidden earlier seemed heavier than ever. A sudden noise snapped him out of his thoughts. Footsteps, faint but deliberate, approached from the direction of the camp. Red's hand instinctively went to his rifle as he peered into the darkness. A figure emerged from the shadows. Brooks. "Malloy," Brooks said, his voice quiet but firm. "Get up." Red rose slowly, his heart pounding. "What is it?" "We need to talk." Brooks gestured for him to follow. Red hesitated, but the cold look in Brooks' eyes left him no choice. He followed him to the edge of the clearing where the river's surface glinted faintly in the moonlight. "Why don't you tell me the truth?" Brooks said, his voice low but dangerous. "About Mason, about the ambush." "I don't know what you're talking about," Red said, his voice shaking. Brooks stepped closer, his face inches from Red's. "You think we don't know? Mason saw it. Now we all see it. So I'll ask you one more time. What happened?" Red's mind raced. Deny it. Confess. Run. None of the options seemed viable. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, Brooks grabbed him by the collar and slammed him against a tree. "You sold us out, didn't you?" Brooks hissed. "No," Red shouted, his voice echoing through the jungle. "I didn't." The sound of rustling in the underbrush cut him off. Both men froze, their eyes darting toward the tree line. Red's pulse raced as the rustling grew louder. Then, without warning, gunfire erupted. Viet Cong soldiers emerged from the shadows, their weapons trained on the clearing. Brooks released Red and raised his rifle, shouting for the others. Chaos erupted as the squad scrambled to defend themselves. Red dove for cover, his heart pounding. The firefight was brutal and disorienting. Bullets tore through the trees and the air was thick with smoke and shouting. Red fired blindly, his mind racing. He knew this wasn't a coincidence. The Viet Cong had been tipped off again. In the chaos, Red saw Brooks fall, clutching his side as blood seeped through his uniform. Red hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to run, but something pulled him toward Brooks. He crawled through the underbrush, grabbing Brooks's arm and dragging him behind a tree. Brooks coughed, blood staining his lips. You did this," he rasped. Red shook his head. "No, I didn't. But the words felt hollow, even to him. Brooks stared at him, his expression a mix of pain and fury before his body went limp. The firefight ended as quickly as it had begun. The Viet Cong retreated, leaving the clearing littered with bodies. Red stood amidst the carnage, his hands trembling. The squad was gone. Brooks was gone. And the gold was still out there, waiting. Red turned toward the river, its surface calm and unbothered by the violence. He knew he couldn't go back. The squad had been destroyed by betrayal, and the guilt weighed heavier than the gold ever could. As he walked along the riverbank, he realized he was utterly alone. The gold gleamed faintly in his mind, a cruel reminder of the cost of greed. Red Malloy had betrayed his brothers for it, and now it was all he had left.